all the wonderful people that made this great moment in my life come true.
I've been watching a lot of controversial movies recently, and I couldn't help but feel that although engagement is allegedly the currency of our time, culturally, cinema no longer seems to want to attract any of it. It used to be that people went to the movies to share in an experience and talk about it with their peers. It was a conversation starter that opened up mental doors that may have otherwise remained closed. But now it feels like there's a certain bite missing from the cinematic scene. That isn't to say that there isn't smut or violence on TV or in film. If anything, there's more than ever. But it's not testing the audience in quite the same way. It doesn't feel quite as risky or willing to shock or offend. Every filmmaker is subject to the creative environment of the time they're working in. You don't always make what you want to make, you make what you can get made. And in our current era, it's as if the established studios don't want the backlash, as they have brand identities to protect, and the upcoming filmmakers don't want to risk being cancelled before their career has even begun. Everyone's incentives make sense, but the results are that we just have less to be excited about or talk about. So is it that controversial topics have just been relegated to social media? Or is it just that everything has already been done and nothing shocks us anymore? To me, even if we don't realize it at the time of the project's release, edgy and risky content has an important role to play in propelling our creative environment forward. It helps us to find the line, and after that line has been established, studios and producers are now more willing to fund projects that play within those new parameters. But it takes someone pushing the boundary and risking absolute failure, dismissal, and condemnation for that next batch of projects to evolve. So with that in mind, let's take a look at some of the most controversial movies ever made, to understand how they contributed to and shaped the cinematic world we live in. Now before we start, it's important to note that to some degree, all of us can be offended. We all have certain boundaries that, when crossed, make us feel uncomfortable. We may be disgusted, upset, angry, but the question is what we then do with those feelings. Is your instinct to say, I personally hate this thing, but respect its right to exist, or I personally hate this thing so much that I want it to be banned? Generally, when people take the latter view, they're advocating for the benefit of broader society. They believe others should not be allowed to choose whether or not to watch it because its very presence within the cultural conversation will negatively influence the population as a whole. For those of you who automatically disagree with this perspective, it's worth noting that you may experience similar instincts when your own taboos get crossed, as we each have certain things we want censored in some way. For example, despite the existence of the true crime genre, I would suspect that most of us would agree that footage of real crimes being committed against real victims should never be sold as any form of entertainment, as not only is that criminal activity, but it would be exploitative of the victims involved. But when it comes to art, specifically narrative fiction, I'm talking make-believe, simulated, recreated, and produced situations with consenting actors. The real question is, who gets to define decency? Who gets to say no, that's too far? Who can honestly look themselves in the mirror with a straight face and say, I am morally pure enough to judge what can and can't be seen for everyone else? Historically speaking, it was usually religious institutions.
This is betraying the biblical Jesus, the historical Christ of the scriptures.
Religious groups are particularly easy to offend, and it makes sense. If they're espousing the literal word of God, then they feel they have the right, no, the duty, to defend God's honor. After all, it's often written into their religious texts that blasphemy is a sin.
You don't need to follow me. You don't need to follow anybody.
So in 1979, when Monty Python poked fun at Christians' religious beliefs by placing modern-day skepticism, behavior, and humor back in biblical times, they didn't like it one bit. It was wrong. So the church protested the film, to the point it was banned in Ireland and Norway. But by doing so, they inadvertently promoted its existence even more. And all that attention allowed the movie to open in 3 times the number of screens than originally scheduled. They even marketed the film in Sweden as being so funny it was banned in Norway. This prompted John Cleese to say that the protesters actually made me rich. I feel we should send them a crate of champagne or something. 6 years earlier, William Friedkin had experienced something similar with The Exorcist, which became one of the highest grossing movies of the year. But it didn't do it all on its own. It had a helping hand from some high-ranking members of the church who wanted to ban the film.
Down with this sort of thing! Careful now.
The director excitedly embraced the backlash, stating one of the best things that could happen is if the Pope denounces it. The special effects in this movie were so far ahead of its time that The Exorcist was considered a genuine demonic force of a film, as some young women left the theaters feeling as if they too were possessed by an evil spirit. Now, with the benefit of hindsight, we can see that it turns out it was just a film. But audiences had never experienced such a challenging piece of work before, and the public outcry succeeded in having the movie banned from home release for 11 years in the UK. Their classification board stated, the board must consider the work's suitability for viewing in the home, where there's far less control of audience age. We have too much evidence of teenagers being disturbed by it in the cinema, particularly girls, as well as advice from child psychologists that it could be seriously disturbing to young people. Cut to today, and nobody cares. But strangely, it was Martin Scorsese's The Last Temptation of Christ that garnered the most controversy, for daring to depict Jesus on the cross, even imagining an alternative life where he married Mary Magdalene and had a child of his own. It turns out that sex scenes starring the Messiah himself were a bridge too far. No matter the intention of the filmmaker, they were in for a rough ride. A French fundamentalist group blasted Molotov cocktails into a cinema in Paris. The film was banned in certain theatre chains throughout the United States and outright banned in the Philippines and Singapore to this day. In America, certain gay communities took it upon themselves to counter-protest the religious protesters on First Amendment grounds, although they would then later protest negative depictions of their own community in controversial movies such as The Silence of the Lambs and Cruising. So again, there isn't just one community that tries to ban movies. This is a social phenomenon that has always, and maybe will always exist. But whether you found The Life of Brian funny, The Exorcist disturbing, or The Last Temptation of Christ enlightening is besides the point. These movies paved the way for blasphemous religious depictions in media today, at least when it comes to Christianity. The Exorcist is now a continuing franchise, having inspired endless movies about spiritual demons from all corners of the world. And animated sitcoms like South Park or Family Guy freely depict Jesus in outrageous and comedic situations with no real controversy or backlash at all. So what was once unthinkable and taboo is now just everyday, and that reality is probably what the protesters were so against to begin with, as it culturally undermines the power and prominence of their beliefs. Although the ban on profanity was lifted in 1968, movie violence has been a contentious topic over the last 60 years. At this stage, bloody, gory violence is commonplace in both TV and film. It still doesn't make it not shocking, as we'll always struggle not to squirm at violent set pieces in some way, but the idea of something being banned for being too violent feels far-fetched in the modern world, no matter how hard filmmakers try to outdo each other. But this was not always the case. In 1967, Bonnie and Clyde was one of the first films to ever use squibs, those explosive packets of fake blood that you place inside an actor's clothes, which made its famous final scene all the more haunting. Critics didn't know what to feel about it, and many condemned the film for its tasteless violence. But audiences embraced the shock, and although they were struck by the brutal ending for the title characters, the movie opened the floodgates to a new era of cinematic violence, from The Wild Bunch to The Godfather and Taxi Driver, which would only further inspire many more filmmakers to come. However, horror movies are where our tolerance for violence is truly tested. And so many of the most famous horror movies ever made pushed boundaries or were at least inspired by others who bravely paved the way. For example, in 1960, two shocking movies were released that would give birth to the slasher genre. One would go on to be regarded as a legendary masterpiece, and the other would be largely forgotten. When Psycho was first released, critics were appalled and marked it as the end of Hitchcock's career. But American audiences ferociously disagreed. They were excited and thrilled by everything the critics hated. This is a clear example of the filmmaker understanding the audience better than the tastemakers of the time. For instance, even though it ran the risk of being less profitable, Hitchcock insisted that movie theaters display signs that stated it is required that you see Psycho from the beginning, as this would drum up audience interest in what exactly was so fascinating about the beginning of his movie. He clearly understood that he was bringing the viewer on a shocking thrill ride of twists and turns that they would have to tell their friends about. The film was initially banned in Ireland, and UK censors trimmed out segments of the stabbing sequences, but it didn't matter. This one risky move would change cinema forever. Sadly, Peeping Tom would not share in its success. Critics found the film flat out revolting, and therefore director Michael Powell's career seemed to be circling the drain. The idea that anyone could make a film following a sick murderer who obsessively records his victims as he kills them was viewed as nothing but poor taste. However, all the classic tropes that would later inspire movies like Halloween and Scream were already there. Not to mention that Peeping Tom started the trend of using the killer's point of view when sneaking up on a victim. With the benefit of hindsight, everyone can now see that Peeping Tom was groundbreaking, but the penalty Powell paid for being ahead of his time was significant. The slasher genre was once again revolutionized in 1974 with Tobe Hooper's The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Everyone from Ridley Scott to Tarantino to Stephen King rightly praised the film, as it's one of the few old slasher movies that still holds up today. Although the director somehow felt the film could be classified as PG due to the lack of blood and how much was left up to the viewer's imagination, his movie was immediately banned in Ireland, France, Brazil, Norway, Sweden, and Iceland for its raw violence. Which links us into a whole different brand of controversy, making your horror movie out to be a true story even when it isn't. And for this there's no clearer example than Cannibal Holocaust. When you're the first one to ever do it, unsurprisingly there are consequences for presenting your movie as real found footage from a deceased documentary crew. Which is why 10 days after its release, the Italian authorities seized the horror picture, assuming it was a snuff film. But by that stage it had already earned $2 million at the box office. This director clearly wanted to draw as much attention to his movie as possible, so these false rumors swirled that he and the movie's producers would be charged with murder, and then even more rumors circulated that he geniusly made the actors sign a contract to not appear in public for a year after filming so that everyone would believe they were really dead. However, the lead actor denied the existence of any such contract. But despite being pure fiction, due to the movie's real footage of slaughtering animals, it was banned in over 50 countries. And whether you like the film or not, you cannot deny just how influential it was. The entire found footage genre, from the Blair Witch Project to Paranormal Activity and beyond, has Cannibal Holocaust to thank. But I think it's worth stating that a movie being controversial does not automatically mean it's good. I mean, it might mean it's interesting, but it's certainly not a measurement of quality. I would say oftentimes the most controversial movies ever made are not necessarily your favorite movies, as they're typically low budget or just so focused on breaking a boundary that they forget to tell a satisfying story. However, they do play an essential part in shifting the Overton window. They crawled so the next generation could walk, and those movies then walked so the next generation could run. For instance, without Salò or 120 Days of Saddam, often referred to as the sickest film of all time, would we have other twisted torture movies about humans lording power over one another? The likes of Battle Royale, Hostel, or The Human Centipede spring to mind. Now fair enough, you might say we don't need any of them, as you hate that genre, but notice how one breakthrough opens the door to the next. For instance, Straw Dogs inspired other home invasion movies like Home Alone, The Purge, The Strangers, and You're Next. Without Ken Park or Kids, would we have TV series like Skins or Euphoria?
Who wants to be famous? Who wants to die for art?
Without John Waters' Female Trouble, where Don Davenport heinously shoots into the crowd as a form of twisted entertainment, would we have the likes of Taxi Driver, The King of Comedy, or Joker? It's hard to say. Culture influences all of us, yet culture is always evolving. So by throwing another ingredient into the creative pot, even if it's bitter and hard to swallow, these unique flavors, however fringe, still contribute to the overall taste. But aside from what's physically depicted on screen, censors often take issue with the tone of the story more than anything, as they're looking at the takeaway message of the piece, the vibes. Rarely are they concerned about what a high-minded viewer might extract from the work of art, but what the lesser-minded viewer might enjoy about the footage. This is where movies like A Clockwork Orange ran into trouble in 1971. The protagonist is an anti-hero who visibly enjoys the sadistic acts he's committing, and Kubrick's film initially seems to be on his side. The classical music gives the story a whimsical feel, as if violence and all forms of assault are the highest form of fun. This rattled censors, as the first 40 minutes of the movie feel like it's promoting nihilistic criminal activity, as if why not just go out and do whatever you please, regardless of who you're hurting in the process. Now, could it have been done with less violence, less sex, and less nudity? Sure, but it also would have been less effective, and Kubrick had an uncompromising vision that was about to be tested. Aside from his film being banned in Ireland and Singapore for over 25 years, the director's family endured death threats and protests outside their home after a series of copycat crimes laid blame at his movie's feet. Due to the never-ending uproar, Kubrick pulled the film from British release, while stating, "To try and fasten any responsibility on art as the cause of life seems to me to put the case the wrong way around. Art consists of reshaping life, but it does not create life nor cause life. Furthermore, to attribute powerful suggestive qualities to a film is at odds with the scientifically accepted view that even after deep hypnosis, in a post-hypnotic state, people cannot be made to do things which are at odds with their natures." Writer-director John Waters found himself in similar hot water with his intentionally provocative Pink Flamingos, in which notoriously trashy criminals compete for the title of the filthiest people alive. The movie was made for a tiny $12 grand, but went on to gross over $7 million, as in 1972 there was an encouraging creative culture around pushing the envelope. Due to the playful tone of the despicable acts unfolding on screen, the film was of course going to be banned. The only question was where, and so far the answer has been Switzerland, Norway, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. In its most famous stunt, the star of the film Divine picks up and eats freshly delivered dog poop. Why? Well, according to John Waters, "I had to get people's attention some way. I figured if I did that, no one would ever be able to forget it, and that it would be a first and last in film history. It was the first idea I had for the whole movie. I had 10 grand, and I knew I had to compete with regular movies. You have to go way out on a limb, and give them something that the studios would never want to give them." Whether the film would receive such a reception today is another question, but audiences back then were surprisingly enthusiastic to be tested, to be grossed out, to be offended. Just look at these genuine reactions from moviegoers walking out of the theater in 1972.
Marvelous, absolutely.
Most disgusting thing I've ever seen in my whole life.
It was really the grossest film I'd seen.
Really fun. Excellent.
Yes,
Loved it.
It's hard to imagine viewers walking out of a cinema today having a similar reaction to anything, especially to something that genuinely disgusted or challenged them. It's easy to look back on movies that were banned or controversial at the time and think, oh, how silly people were back then. But unless those creative boundaries got broken, you might hold that same attitude today. You still might hold it on certain issues right now, unbeknownst to yourself. As whenever a cinematic boundary is broken, it's meant to feel uncomfortable. So you can either embrace it, or try to put the toothpaste back in the tube, by banning it, hiding it, and shaming it. Or if you're unsure, just wait, as what you feel about a movie today may not be what you feel about it 1, 2, or 10 years from now. It will stay the same, but you and the world around it are always changing. So if researching this video has taught me anything, it's to be less hasty to judge the potential lasting effects of a film, as first impressions are often deceiving. But what frustrates me about modern mainstream movies is that it doesn't feel as if it's trying to test boundaries the same way anymore. Sure, we get the occasional culture war movie here and there, but they're mostly just political, rather than about challenging the viewer or the medium on a deeper level. And it's not like we don't have the opportunity for it. There's literally more content than ever before. But perhaps due to the invention of social media, as an audience we've lost our collective appetite for it. But in so many cases, controversy drives interest, which drives ticket sales, or at the very least enough intrigue to click. Because let's not forget that right now, we have streaming platforms that technically have free reign to produce anything they want. They could be serving us up the most out-there projects, easily promoting them by simply putting them on their front page and giving us all something to talk about. But they don't. And it seems as if most streaming platforms are prioritizing maintaining positive brand association over pushing the envelope, which makes financial sense, as that way they don't shut down any possibilities for future monetization given the precarious state of the industry. But sensible corporate policy is not exactly inspiring to say out loud. Even YouTube, the place you're listening to this right now, is an amazing platform for low-budget content, but its code of conduct is effectively ruled by the advertiser's standards, who are also trying to maintain positive brand association, which leads to limits on the types of content that can be broadcast or monetized here too. This is why cinema is such an important part of the filmmaking process, as it's a relationship purely between the filmmakers and the audience. You pay money to see that film in that theater at that time, and there are no advertisers trying to tame everything down to make it palatable enough to appear next to their logo. And you may think, who cares if we don't have any more boundary-pushing movies? We've conquered more than enough land, so we can just colour within these lines and have a good time. And that's not entirely wrong, but it's also limiting. As if no one goes too far or makes a loud enough statement to leave a mark, then there's no new footprints to follow. Most of your favourite movies were influenced by other films before them, so we have to keep that risk-taking spirit alive, or we begin to creatively stagnate and eventually sink into grey filmmaking. Not too light, not too dark, just a forgettable, inoffensive, acceptable shade of grey. How inspiring. So that's all from me, but so that the comment section can be something of a resource to anyone interested in this topic, what are some examples that you think I missed? What's the most offensive movie you've ever seen? Is there a movie you actually think should be banned? If so, why? And who are the modern filmmakers that you think need more recognition for the creative risks they're taking right now?